I found out about the vote from a text message, not a phone call, not a conversation. A text message from my cousin Bria sent at 11:47 on a Wednesday night that said, "Hey, I need you to know something, and I'm sorry I waited this long to tell you. Call me when you can." I stared at that message for 30 seconds. Then I called her. She answered immediately, which meant she'd been waiting with her phone in her hand. What she told me took about 10 minutes to say and about 3 weeks to fully absorb. 6 months earlier, while I was in Vancouver finishing the last edit of my documentary, while I was working 18-hour days in a rented suite with blackout curtains and a whiteboard covered in sticky notes, while I was doing the thing I'd spent my entire adult life working toward, my family had gathered at my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon and held a vote. A vote about me, about whether I still belonged to them. I want you to sit with that for a second. I need you to understand what I mean when I say the word vote. Not a heated argument, not a conversation that got out of hand. A structured, deliberate, organized vote, with my parents presiding on the question of whether their daughter, their firstborn, their flesh should be formally and permanently cut off from the family. The result had been 4-1 in favor of disownment. Bria was the one. I need to tell you what I do, because it's the whole reason any of this happened. I make documentaries, not the kind that play in corporate lobbies. The real kind, long, uncomfortable, specific. I've spent the last 8 years following stories that most people would rather look away from. A film about 3 families living on contaminated land, fighting a corporation that knew and said nothing. A film about a school system that had been quietly failing an entire generation of children for 20 years. A film about women in a particular industry who had been silenced so thoroughly and for so long that the silence had become its own kind of architecture. None of these are comfortable films. None of them performed well at family dinners. My second documentary was cited in a congressional hearing, which I consider one of the greatest achievements of my life. And when I called my mother to tell her, she said, "I just wish you'd chosen something more stable." That was my mother. Every time, some version of that. My father's concern was different. His concern was what people thought. He came from a family where what you did for a living was a statement about who you were, and the statement he'd imagined his daughter making was a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, something you could explain at a dinner party without watching people's expressions get complicated. Documentary filmmaker made people's expressions complicated, especially once they'd seen my work. My third film was the one that broke something open between us. It dealt with a subject close to our community, a kind of quiet cultural hypocrisy that a lot of people recognized, and no one had wanted named out loud. My parents watched it, finally, after months of me asking them to, and my father turned it off 20 minutes from the end and said it was an embarrassment, that I had put private things in public, that I had no respect for where I came from. I said I had enormous respect for where I came from. I said that was actually why I made it. He said we clearly had different definitions of respect, and we didn't speak for 2 months. That was 18 months before the vote. While I was in Vancouver, I thought my family's silence was about my fourth film. I was in the early stages of it, a film about a specific type of financial fraud that had gutted a particular community over a decade, the kind of story where the research alone takes a year. I had mentioned it to my mother on a phone call, and she had gone very quiet in a way that I interpreted as disapproval, and she had apparently interpreted as something else entirely. What it apparently was, I later found out, was the moment she called my father and said, "She's doing it again. We need to do something." I don't know all the details of how the vote came together. Bria filled in what she could, but she hadn't been told about it in advance. She'd shown up for what she thought was a regular Sunday dinner and found an agenda. I'm not joking about that. Bria said there was an actual agenda, handwritten on a notepad sitting at the center of the table. My parents were there. My father's brother, Uncle Richard, was there, a man I had always found difficult, a man who had once told me at a holiday meal that women who didn't want to be wives were confused, a man whose opinion of my life choices was consistent and vocally held. His wife, my Aunt Cheryl, my cousin Marcus, who is Uncle Richard's son, and who had never once in our shared lifetime said anything kind about anything I'd accomplished, and Bria, who had been told simply that there was a family matter to discuss. The agenda, as Bria described it, had 3 items. The first was a summary of my career choices and what my parents characterized as their impact on the family's reputation. The second was a discussion of whether continued association constituted an endorsement of choices they found contrary to the family's values. The third was the vote. Bria said she sat there for the first 2 items in a state of disbelief that she described as watching something happen that you can't believe is real, but your eyes are reporting it to you clearly. When it came to the vote, she said no. She said it forcefully, apparently. She said she told them this was wrong and that if I knew what they were doing, I'd be devastated. My mother said I didn't need to know, that it was a family matter, that everyone present was asked to keep it in confidence. Bria had kept it for 6 months, she told me, because she was afraid and ashamed and didn't know how to say it. And then she heard I was coming home from Vancouver, and she realized that if I walked back into that family without knowing, I would walk into something I didn't understand. I'm sorry, she said. I should have called you the same day. I told her I was glad she called me at all. I stayed up until 4 a.m, and I stared at my ceiling, and I thought about my grandmother. My grandmother Cecile was my father's mother, which is what made everything that came later so specifically interesting. She was a woman who had built things, a woman who, in an era that made building things extremely difficult for someone who looked like her, had managed to accumulate a quiet, serious estate, property, investments, a collection of things whose value I didn't fully understand until I was much older. She had done it carefully, the way people do when they know that what they're building could be taken if they're not careful. She had done it without fanfare. She was also a woman who had watched her son, my father, with clear eyes for his entire life. She loved him. I never doubted that. But she saw him. She saw the way he needed things to look a certain way. She saw the way he confused reputation with character. She saw, I think, what his house did to me, what the pressure and the expectation and the constant management of appearances did to her granddaughter, who just wanted to tell true stories. She and I had a relationship that was quiet and specific. We didn't always talk about big things. Sometimes we just sat together. She used to watch my films, all of them, even the hard ones, and she never once said she wished I'd made different choices. She passed away the spring before I went to Vancouver. I was at her bedside. My father was there. My Uncle Richard was there. Her estate had been in the process of being settled for several months. There were assets, significant ones. Property, primarily a house, 2 rental units, a piece of land that had been in the family for decades. I had not expected to be in her will. That's not false modesty. I genuinely hadn't thought about it. Grandma Cecile and I had something that felt too personal to be about money. I assumed the estate would go to her children, my father and my uncle, the way these things usually went. That assumption turned out to be interestingly incomplete. I landed on a Thursday. I didn't call my parents from the airport. I took a cab to my own apartment, dropped my bags, showered, slept for 11 hours, and then spent 3 days moving slowly through re-entry, the particular readjustment that happens after you've been deep in a project and have to remember how to exist in ordinary time. I thought about what Bria had told me. I thought about it constantly, actually, the way you think about something that has changed the map of a place you thought you knew. I wasn't ready to confront my parents. Not yet. Not without understanding the full picture. On the 4th day, I got a letter. Not from my parents. From an attorney's office, my grandmother's estate attorney, a firm I recognized from paperwork I'd seen in the weeks after her passing. The letter said that the estate settlement was approaching its final stage, and that there were matters relating to the distribution of certain assets that required my presence at a formal reading. I called the office. The attorney, a woman named Constance, was warm but precise. She confirmed that I was named in the estate documents. She confirmed the meeting date. When I asked if she could tell me anything in advance, she said, gently, that it would be better for everyone present to hear it together. I noted the phrase, everyone present. I asked who would be there. She read me the names. My father, my Uncle Richard, me, no one else. I wrote the date in my calendar. I went to bed that night with my grandmother's face in my mind, and a feeling I couldn't entirely name, something between grief and the very early edge of understanding. I arrived at Constance's office 8 minutes early. My father and Uncle Richard were already there. My father stood when I came in, which surprised me. Uncle Richard did not stand. He looked at me with the expression he'd been directing at me since I was 23, and decided that his opinion of my choices was not going to determine my choices. My father and I looked at each other. He had aged, I noticed. Not dramatically, but specifically around the eyes, in the set of his shoulders. Something in him that used to be held very upright had softened, or maybe sagged was the better word. Nadia, he said. Dad, I said. We sat down. We did not hug. We did not speak further. Constance came in with a colleague, arranged papers, offered water that nobody took, and began. She opened with the standard language. The date, the deceased, the document's validity, its execution, the witnesses. All of it verified, all of it in order. She read through the early sections, the personal effects, the specific bequests to various people, a donation to a community organization my grandmother had supported for 30 years. My uncle shifted in his seat approximately every 90 seconds. My father was very still. Then Constance reached the section on the property assets. She set down one page and picked up another, and she looked over her glasses at the three of us with an expression that was entirely professional and communicated nothing. Then she began to read. My grandmother had divided her estate into 2 portions. The first portion, one of the rental units, a specific investment account, was left jointly to her 2 sons. My father, my uncle, standard, expected. The second portion, the family house, the second rental unit, and a land parcel whose value I would only fully understand later, was handled differently. Constance read the language slowly. The second portion was to be held in a trust. The trust had a condition. The condition was this. The assets in the trust were to pass to Cecile's granddaughter, Nadia. That was me, my full name in the document, provided that no member of the immediate family had, at any point following the execution of this will, made a formal or documented attempt to sever Nadia's relationship with the family on the basis of her professional choices. Should such an attempt be found to have occurred, the assets in the trust would pass entirely and irrevocably to Nadia without condition, and the family members involved in any such attempt would be excluded from any benefit, direct or indirect, from the trust's holdings. Constance looked up from the page. The room was very quiet. My uncle said, "What does that mean exactly?" Constance said, It means exactly what it says. She turned to a second document. A supplementary clause, she explained, executed 8 months before my grandmother's death, after she was sick, but while she was entirely of sound mind, witnessed by 2 independent parties, notarized, unambiguous. The clause named, specifically, any vote, formal meeting, or organized attempt by family members to disown or sever ties with Nadia on the basis of her career as a trigger condition. Constance put the document on the table and folded her hands. "Were you aware," she said, looking at my father directly, "of your mother's wishes on this matter?" My father's face had done several things in the last 2 minutes. It had gone still, then stricken, then something I can only describe as a man watching the past rearrange itself in real time. "She never told me," he said. His voice was different, quieter than I'd ever heard it. "She told me," Constance said, quite clearly. "She also told me when she signed this clause that she hoped it would never need to be enforced, that she hoped her family would make better choices than she feared they might." The room was quiet again. I had not spoken yet. I had been sitting with my hands in my lap and my breathing very even, looking at the document on the table, thinking about a woman who watched her son clearly her entire life and decided, quietly with no fanfare, to protect her granddaughter in the one language that couldn't be argued with. I thought about how she'd known, about what it meant that she'd had this drawn up 8 months before she died, which was, I counted it in my head sitting in that room, approximately 4 months before my father held his vote. She had known it was coming before it happened. She had known her son. My uncle left first. He didn't say anything. He picked up his jacket, nodded at Constance in a way that acknowledged nothing, and walked out. My father stayed. Constance gave us some privacy. She stepped out with her colleague and closed the door, and my father and I were alone in a room together for the first time since before Vancouver. He was looking at the table. "She knew," he said. "Not to me, exactly. To the air." "Yes," I said. "She never said anything to me." "No," I said. "She said something to her attorney instead, because she knew what you needed to hear from you needed to come from you." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the quality of the silence changed. "Your film," he said finally, "the third one, I turned it off." "I know. I watched the rest of it. Later, when you were in Vancouver." I looked at him. "I watched all of it," he said. "The whole thing. By myself." He didn't say what he thought of it. He didn't apologize. Not right then. What he did was look at me for a long moment with something raw in his face, something that had been there his whole life, maybe, under the dinner party concerns and the agenda at the kitchen table, and the 10 years of, "I just wish you'd chosen something more stable." "Your grandmother," he said, "was very proud of you." I breathed in slowly. "I know she was," I said. The formal legal determination took 6 weeks. Constance's office reviewed the documentation from the Sunday vote. Bria provided a written account, which she gave without hesitation, and with what she later told me felt like years of tension leaving her body. There were 2 other people at that table who, once they understood the legal implications of their presence, provided accounts of their own. The record was clear. The trigger condition had been met. The house, the second rental unit, the land parcel, all of it passed to me, fully, irrevocably, without condition. The land, it turned out, was in a part of the city that had changed significantly in the decades since my grandmother acquired it. A developer reached out within 3 weeks of the title transfer. I sat with that offer for a long time. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to make the decision carefully, the way my grandmother made decisions. I sold the land. I kept the house. My uncle stopped speaking to my father shortly after the reading. I understand there were disagreements about who was responsible for the outcome. I understand my uncle felt that my father had been warned and had proceeded anyway. These were their problems to work through, and I was not involved. My father called me the night after the legal determination was finalized. He said, "I handled you wrong. For a long time, I didn't understand what you were doing, and I was afraid of it. And I turned that into something I aimed at you. And it wasn't right." He said it all in one go, like he'd practiced it, which I think he had. I let him finish. "Okay," I said. "Okay. I heard you, Dad. I believe you mean it. That's the beginning of something, not the end. So, okay." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother would have explained it better than I just did." "She explained most things better than anyone," I said. "That was kind of her whole thing." I heard something on his end. Not quite a laugh. Something in that direction. My fourth film came out 14 months after the day in Constance's office. It's the best thing I've ever made. I say that without false modesty and without waiting for someone to agree with me. I know what it cost to make it, and I know what it does, and I'm proud of it the way you're proud of something that required everything you had. I watched it for the first time with an audience at a festival, a big screen, strangers in the dark, that particular electricity of a room full of people experiencing something together. I sat in the back row. I cried a little quietly, and not because of anything in the film. I cried because I thought about the vote. 6 people in a room deciding I didn't belong to them anymore because of work like this. Because I told stories they found uncomfortable. Because I pointed cameras at things they'd rather stay in the dark. And I thought about another room. My grandmother, older and sick and clear-eyed, sitting across from an attorney, making sure. She had been so certain of me. She had been certain before I was certain myself. She had looked at her son and seen what was coming, and instead of a conversation, instead of an argument, instead of a plea, she had simply made sure. She'd built a legal document around her certainty about who I was. I cannot think of a more specific or more profound expression of love. The house is mine. I don't live in it full time. I travel too much for that. But when I'm home, I stay there. I've changed very little about it. Her things are mostly still where she left them. The kitchen still smells the way it smelled when I was a child sitting at her table, watching her be still and certain in the way that she was. I'm making a new film. I'm always making a new film. And I'm not asking anyone's permission. I never was really. I just know it more completely now.